Welcome to the Jesus Movement Live, everybody. It's wonderful to have everyone who's here with us tonight, and welcome to everybody who's joining us online. We're continuing on with our Journey to Faith series. Tonight we're actually on to lesson 39, and as the title says, it's David unites the kingdom of Israel. We've been following the journey of each of the descendants from the genealogy of Jesus, from Abraham right now through until David. This is the third lesson with David. David has a large story in the Bible, a very significant person, and a person who, in fact, if he wasn't real, the prophecies of the Bible wouldn't have been fulfilled. It's interesting, at this point in time, I've been listening to what's going on in Jerusalem. There's a lot of archaeological work being done over there because of the COVID-19 at the moment. The border's closed, and they're actually excavating places which is revealing a lot about David and artifacts that are dated to David's time, and they're basically saying that they can categorically prove that David was not just a fictional or biblical figure, but in fact there's archaeological evidence that makes it clear that he was absolutely who he was. He was the king of Israel, and he did live, and we spoke about that last week when we had a look at the Tel Dan stele. But there's been a lot of new evidence that's been dug up at this point in time. They're excavating a site called Ziklag, and they're also at the Tel Es-Safit, which is ancient Gath. And of course, Gath is where Goliath was known to live, and so they're excavating there, and they've actually found a horned altar. So the horned altars are the biblical altars. It's just been uncovered in the last couple of days. And so this is a very exciting find. A couple of students from overseas countries, one from Korea was there and uncovered this. And so they're saying that this is obviously archaeological proof or evidence that the Israelites actually did live there, and that they did have a place of worship there. Places of worship for the Israelites were different to those who came before them. And so the horned altar with the four horns on the corners is an altar which is not duplicated in any other form of worship. And so it's been quite an exciting time. So it's nice to be talking about King David's journey at the moment, and finding, as we're speaking, that archaeological work in Israel is actually supporting his story as we teach it. So it's been fascinating. Now, last week we ran through the story called The Pursuit of David. And in the pursuit of David, we're looking at his time when he was being chased by King Saul. And last week we learnt about how King Saul and his son Jonathan were killed. And we had a look at some video clips from Israel, as well as some pictures and illustrations, and told that sort of story. Now, with Jonathan killed, we find that King Saul's other son, Ish-Bosheth, has laid a claim to the throne of Israel. And so we found that his army captain last week, he actually came and declared to David that he would swear allegiance to him and thus work towards the removal of this false claim. Let it be said that Ish-Bosheth knew that David was anointed by the Lord as the next king of Israel, and so his claim wasn't worthy, and he knows it, but he's going for it anyway. Why? Because he believes he's inheriting the throne from his father, which is the normal practice. However, in this instance, the throne has actually been given to David because he was anointed by the prophet Samuel. And so we pick up from there this week. So King David was holding court when messengers were ushered into his presence. They said they had been sent by the enemy commander Abner, son of Ner, and they spoke on Abner's behalf. So we go to our first scripture for tonight. We are in the second book of Samuel now. So we're going to 2 Samuel chapter 3, verses 12 to 13. And it reads, "Whose land is it? Make an argument with me, and I will help you bring all Israel over to you." "Good," said David, "I will make an agreement with you. But I demand one thing of you. Do not come into my presence unless you bring Michal, daughter of Saul, when you come to see me." Why did he want the daughter of Saul? Michal?
It was his wife.
As his wife. He was married to her, and she'd been left behind when he went on the run. So King David then sent his own messengers to King Ish-Bosheth, and they relayed his demand in verse 14 of 2 Samuel chapter 3. And this was, "Give me my wife Michal, whom I betrothed to myself for the price of 100 Philistine foreskins." Bit of a strange thing to say, you can't imagine that today, but that's the way it was. That's how he won her hand in marriage. So King Ish-Bosheth issued orders, and she was taken from her husband and sent to King David. So the false accusation of the commander Abner had left the self-appointed King Ish-Bosheth vulnerable. Being well aware that David had been anointed by God to rule over Israel and Judah, Abner's switch of allegiance only served to remind King Saul's son that he was only trying to serve his own purposes, and that his pride to inherit his father's position now led him to fight against the Lord Almighty. Although David had been approached by Abner's messengers, he did not reveal this. Instead, he sent his own messengers to King Ish-Bosheth and demanded that his sister Michal, who once loved David and saved his life, be restored to him in a covenant of marriage. Knowing that Michal was only separated from David because of his father's authority, King Ish-Bosheth generously and honourably restored his sister to David, who by being given to another had been forced to live in an adulterous relationship. By granting David's request, King Ish-Bosheth revealed his weakness, whereas Abner, by sending his messengers to David to bring about this outcome, was emboldened and went straight to the elders of Israel. And so that weakness, it might not sound like a weakness, but if you've just wrested a kingship from somebody, probably the last thing you do is going to let your sister head over to a competing king. So we've basically got two kings in two regions, if you will, who are both Israelites. And so he releases his sister. Why? Because he knows that, first of all, his sister was married, but secondly, he knows he has no claim to her. What was done was not right. So in 2 Samuel chapter 3 verses 17 to 18 now, it reads, "For some time you have wanted to make David your king. Now do it. For the Lord promised David, by my servant David I will rescue my people Israel from the hand of the Philistines and from the hand of all their enemies." So after speaking with the elders, Abner then spoke with his people, the Benjamites, and satisfied with the outcome, he then went to Hebron to tell David what Israel and the house of Benjamin wanted to do. So I'm just going to pull out this map. We're going to come back to it, but this is just to sort of give you some understanding. So at this point in time, David is ruling as the king of Hebron. From Hebron, so he's ruling as the king of Judah from Hebron. Gibeah was the location where King Saul ruled from, and we find out shortly that with King Ish-Bosheth, because of the context for this position, he actually moves up to this place called Mahanaim and sets up his throne here where it says number 2. David, when he comes a little bit later, we'll come back to this, will move his throne to Jerusalem, but this just gives you those locations that we're speaking about at the moment. So King David received Abner, who brought 20 men with him. There was a great feast that was prepared for them, and whilst they were dining, Abner disclosed what the elders of Israel and the people of Benjamin wanted to do. Abner, who had already pledged his personal support through his message, made his intention to rally further support amongst his own people clear. In 2 Samuel 3 verse 21 he says, "Let me go at once and assemble all Israel for my lord the king, so that they may make a compact with you and that you may rule over all that your heart desires." You may notice through all this that this has got nothing to do with God. These men are saying, I'll do this for you and I'll do that for you. But David, on the other hand, he always allows God to run his race. He doesn't allow others to. And this comes through in this story that's happening right now. So King David sent Abner and his men away in peace, the same way that they had come. During the discord between King Saul and David, there had been many marauding parties against Judah besides the Philistines. Not all of the land, nor its cities and peoples had been conquered. Joab, the son of David's sister Zeruiah, and commander of his army, had been away leading a party of his men against one such enemy whilst this is happening. Having just successfully returned with a great measure of plunder, Joab learnt that the commander of King Ish-Bosheth's army had just left after seeing David. This was a big problem for him, for it was Abner who had killed his brother Asahel in a battle at Gibeon. And we read about that in 2 Samuel chapter 2, verse 23. So we're working our way through 2 Samuel. And this happened in one of the skirmishes between the men of King Ish-Bosheth and the men of David over the last 2 years. So he has a personal resentment for this man who just came and saw King David, and so he's not happy about it. So just as King David farewelled Abner and his men, his nephew Joab returned with his men after successfully pursuing this enemy who had been raiding Judah. Joab immediately came to see his uncle, and having heard that Abner had just left, he said in 2 Samuel 3 verse 24, "What have you done? Look, Abner came to you. Why did you let him go?" So Joab told David that Abner had only come to spy on him and to deceive him. Before King David could respond, Joab left as abruptly as he arrived to question the king. Joab sent messengers after Abner and had him brought back. What did he do? He stabbed him in the stomach to avenge his brother's death. And Abner died, and David was not informed. So here is this man pledging allegiance to David. He's going to go out to bring other people from Israel to join with him, and we find that Joab has now stabbed him and killed him. So King David was concerned when Joab left, because obviously he'd been talking to him and he suddenly ran away. But his concern turned to anger later when he heard of the foul deed his nephew had perpetrated. His new supporter had been slaughtered, and known as King Ish-Bosheth's commander, people might think that it was at his command that the assassination took place. Remember, David's there to try and unify Israel, and so this is actually going to work against him. So King David spoke out, and he said in 2 Samuel 3 verses 28 to 29, "I and my kingdom are forever innocent before the Lord concerning the blood of Abner, son of Ner. May his blood fall upon the head of Joab and upon his father's house." He needed to demonstrate his innocence. So King David showered Abner with great honour for his funeral and ensured that it was beyond doubt to both the people of Israel and Judah that he had no part in this murder. So when news of Abner's death reached King Ish-Bosheth, he lost his nerve and all Israel became anxious. Two of his leaders, Banar and Rechab, who led his raiding gangs into his home in the middle of the day, when he rested as the sun reached its zenith. They murdered him in his sleep, cut off his head, and then travelled through the night to take it to David. They thought he would be pleased, seeing it as a form of revenge and a quick way to secure the second kingdom. But this act far from pleased David. So here's poor old King David trying to bring his people together, and what are they all doing in his name? They're stabbing each other and cutting off heads and all the rest of it. So it's not helping anything. So King David received Banar and Rechab into his audience room, whereupon he was presented with the head of King Ish-Bosheth. As if the death of Abner wasn't enough, these wicked men claimed in 2 Samuel 4 verse 8, "This day the Lord has avenged my lord the king against Saul and his offspring." Well, clearly the Lord had nothing to do with it. So King David declared to them that they were wicked and had killed an innocent man. He punished them in kind and ordered his men to kill them. And so we find at this point in time that the competition for the rule of Israel has come to a close with the son of King Saul. Banar and Rechab had failed to realise that whilst God had promised King David he would become the ruler of both kingdoms, he still respected that Saul was anointed by God, and Ish-Bosheth was actually his heir. King David never tried to kill either of them, believing that God would take care of this in his own way. With support for King David in both kingdoms, all the tribes of Israel sent their elders to him in Hebron. So at the age of 30, King David is now anointed king of Israel and Judah, and the Israelites become a united kingdom for the first time since they've arrived in the land of Canaan. Okay, so this is a very significant moment. So King David had ruled Judah from Hebron for 2 years, while King Ish-Bosheth ruled Israel from Mahanaim. After the murder of King Ish-Bosheth, the two kingdoms became known as the United Kingdom of Israel, or simply the Kingdom of Israel. Even so, after all the fighting in the land of Canaan for so many years, the newly united Israelite kingdom still had not conquered all of its enemies, nor had it conquered every city and every territory in the land. So King David continued to rule from Hebron for another 5 years and 6 months, until he led his men to attack the unconquered city of Jerusalem. The Canaanite people who lived there, identified as Jebusites in the Bible, believed their fortress city was so impregnable that King David would be unable to get in. So they bragged in 2 Samuel chapter 5 verse 6, "You will not get in here, even the blind and the lame can ward you off." So King David left Hebron with his men and marched northwards up the way to Shur, the highway up through the highlands of the hill country, until he reached Jerusalem. It was time to capture this city and conquer its people, for the covenant God had made with his people had yet to be fulfilled. When King David arrived at the city, he knew that the walls were impregnable and needed another way to gain entry. Does anyone recall the story of how David gets into the city and why?
Through the drains and whatever.
Right.
He went underneath through the drains.
Right.
Is that cistern?
Yeah, there's a well there which leads to a cistern storing water, and there's obviously a pathway for overflow coming out of the walls. And so this is exactly right, so well done. So in 2 Samuel 5:8, it says, "Anyone who conquers the Jebusites will have to use the water shaft to reach those lame and blind who are David's enemies." So every city, and this is the explanation, built in the land of Canaan, was located where there was access to water, which I've mentioned before. No water, no point having a place for people to dwell. In the hill country, this sort of source of water was usually available from these permeable subterranean springs, and the water was brought up from the depths from under the ground. Many of these cities did not contain water inside the city walls, and the city of Jerusalem was no exception. So I did explain this before. You remember why the water wasn't quite inside the walls, but just outside? Do you recall we spoke about this?
For travellers,
For travellers
feeding their flocks.
and people with flocks, the shepherds with the flocks, that's right. So that means they could access the water without actually having to come inside the city. Can you imagine if I had a herd of goats and I wanted water and I drive all my goats inside your city, what sort of a mess it would be? So they would keep them on the outside. So it was common in ancient Canaan that cities were built on top of large tells or mounds. We showed one last week from Beit Shean up north. Large hills or mountainous outcrops of rock, readily able to see the approach of a potential enemy. It was common to build large fortress walls to protect those who lived within. Because of this, it was also commonplace for armies to carry what they call scaling hooks to climb or scale the walls that were designed to repel them. So obviously they would get these things and they would throw them up and the hooks would grab the top and they'd scale up the outside. But one of the flaws in fortress design was the need to draw water up from the ground beneath them. So this is something that they had to have, providing an access for an enemy who were prepared to swim and scale the inside wall of such a water shaft. And just remember, today we take for granted swimming. A lot of people swim. You know, here in Australia where we live, just about everybody learns to swim, but that's not the case all over the world to this day. And in countries like this and in times like this, many people couldn't swim. You know, water was a luxury, there was nowhere to swim. And so this is quite an unusual thing. So King David asked for volunteers to come forward to climb the inside of the water shaft with scaling hooks, keeping his men in full view outside, but with beyond the range of the Jebusite archers on the ramparts of the fortress walls. His volunteers went forward. So the Jebusite soldiers, the defenders, they were focused on the Israelites outside as the volunteers scaled the water shaft from inside. And so if you get the picture now, they're attracting their attention from outside, and these scaling hooks, they've actually brought them inside through the shaft, and they're throwing them up from inside the shaft rather from outside the wall, which they would normally do. And so this is how they're going to get in. Overcoming the unsuspecting gatekeepers first, the Israelite volunteers threw open the city gates. King David patiently watched the city gates from afar, knowing the Lord was with him, so his plan was underway in front of him. So when the gates were swung open, he led his men in on an attack with such an overwhelming force that the Jebusites were quickly overcome, slaughtering every man, woman and child as the Lord had commanded him to do. King David decided to take up residence in the fortress city of Jerusalem and make it his new capital. What did he call it? The City of David. Yeah, so it says this in 2 Samuel chapter 5 verse 9. So David, he's the new king. He enters Jerusalem and he actually calls it the City of David. He's named the city after himself. So this city was conquered in 1003 BC. So just to explain, we'll come back to this map behind me. Under the reign of King Saul, as a yet to be unified Israel, he had been ruling it from Gibeah, a fortress that was situated within the territory of his tribe, the Benjamites. And so again, this is Gibeah here. This is the tribe of Judah down here. The Benjamites are straddled across the top of, just slightly to the north of Jerusalem. So he ruled from there. Following his death in battle, his son Ish-Bosheth was encouraged by his father's cousin Abner to seize the throne despite being aware of the anointing of David as Israel's second king. So 2 new seats of power were established. Ish-Bosheth located his new capital city in the northeast on the other side of the Jordan River, which is this place, Mahanaim. So it's well away from where all of the previous ruling and battles have been fought. So he's clearly moved a long way away from them. Perhaps he thought the distance would allow him to hang on to his throne for longer, but obviously that didn't happen. So whilst David, who reigned over the tribe of Judah only, established his capital city in the southern hill country of Hebron. So this is where he's been ruling from currently that we've been talking about. But now that David had become the sole ruler over all of Israel, it was more desirable for him to have a centrally located city. So the Jebusite city of Jerusalem was situated on the border of the tribal boundaries for the territories given to Judah and to Benjamin, and was ideally situated. So up until now, it had not been incorporated into either tribe. With it being conquered, David made it into a royal territory that would not interfere with the existing land holdings of either tribe. So do you understand that ever since they entered the land of Canaan, right in the middle of all of this territory, Jerusalem had never been conquered. So David was the first person to conquer Jerusalem. And so he's claimed that as a royal city and set it apart because all the other territories had already had their inheritance applied to them. And so he took this as a city, as I said, a royal city, so this was put aside for God. So having a look at some of the detail, the successive capitals, so Gibeah was the capital from 1030 BC to 1010 BC under King Saul, who was the king of a non-united Israel. Mahanaim from 1010 to 1008 BC, so 2 years that King Ish-Bosheth ruled in the north and claimed to be the king of Israel. Hebron, 1008 BC to 1003 BC, so David ruled from there as the king of Judah for 5 years. And the last one, Jerusalem, it would become the United Kingdom, as it was called, but it was the king of the united Judah and Israel. And the Bible tells us that he was the king of both. So Judah and Israel. And this was united from 1003 BC and will stay united until 931 BC, when some events will break Israel into two once again, which we'll come to. So that map should hopefully just give you an idea of the locations and the amount of time spent as the rule changed between the different kings. So settling into Jerusalem, David, who already had 6 sons fathered by 6 mothers, took more wives and concubines and fathered many more children. Some of his sons were called Ibhar, Elishua, Nepheg, Japhia, Elishama, Eliada, and Eliphalet, which is all contained in 2 Samuel chapter 5, verses 14 to 16, and also a child called Jeremoth from 2 Chronicles 11:18, and at least one daughter that the Bible names called Tamar. So having overcome King Saul years earlier, the Philistines had not gone up against the Israelites while they were divided. But as David settled into Jerusalem, when the Philistines heard that he'd been anointed king of Israel, they went up in full force against him. The Philistines tried twice, but the Lord was with David, and they were defeated twice. The Philistines carried their idols into battle, but they were abandoned when they were defeated, and David carried them off with his men. It tells of this in 2 Samuel chapter 5, verse 21. And he gave orders that they were to be burned by fire. And you can read that, funnily enough, in 1 Chronicles chapter 14, verse 12. So once again, with the Bible, we get some of the detail around the story from other books of the Bible. Now that David had made Jerusalem his political capital, he determined that he would also make it the religious capital. So what happens next? Do you recall in the journey for David? What does he do next? So he's overcome Jerusalem. It's set apart because it hasn't been inherited by anyone. He makes that the royal city, a place to rule from. But as a ruler, he also has to have the priesthood with him. So what's missing at this point in time? The temple. What else is missing? The ark. So the ark of the covenant isn't with him. In fact, it hasn't been with any of the rulers for 20 years. And so it comes time that he needs to bring the ark of the covenant to Jerusalem. So he goes to Abinadab's house, which is in Kiriath Jearim, a temporary dwelling where it had been since it fell into the hands of the Philistines. So I'm going to skim a couple of pictures there going forwards, but just to show you the location. So this is Kiriath Jearim. You may remember when they had the battle up here at Ebenezer, the Israelites are coming down from Shiloh, the 2 sons of the priest Eli, and they lost the Ark of the Covenant. It got taken down to the Philistine temples, and then they had the plagues, and they brought it back up to Beth Shemesh. It was opened and looked inside, the men died, and then it was transported and kept at this place called Kiriath Jearim, and it's remained there ever since. So David's now saying, okay, time to bring it from here and bring it up to Jerusalem. So this occurs at this point in time. So having it placed on a cart and pulled by oxen in great festivity, the oxen stumble on this journey, and Uzzah, one of the sons of Abinadab, reached out to steady the ark of God. So we've already learned that those who touched it before had died, but obviously the road was a bit rough, and he reached out to steady it, but this was not permitted, and God struck him down dead. This caused David to be afraid, and he said in 2 Samuel chapter 6 now, verse 9, "How can the ark of the Lord ever come to me?" And so he took it to the house of a man called Obed-Edom, and left it there for 3 months. Obed-Edom and his household were blessed for this, and when David heard, he went back and brought the ark of God to the city of David. As David entered the city, he was watched by his wife Michal, the daughter of Saul, from the window. She was not impressed, for David had been dancing with no clothes, rejoicing before the Lord. So a lot of strange things going on here. So David was obviously not perturbed about not having any clothes on. So here he was dancing with no clothes, and she said to him in 2 Samuel 6 verse 20, "How the king of Israel has distinguished himself today, disrobing in the sight of the slave girls of his servants, as any vulgar fellow would." David had sought to bring the Ark of Covenant to Jerusalem and rejoice, but Michal's disrespect was punished by God, and she was unable to have children. And so we see all these consequences falling out at this point in time. So David placed the Ark of God inside a specially prepared tent and offered burnt sacrifices and fellowship offerings to the Lord in 2 Samuel chapter 6 verse 17. So this is important because this is part of what they're actually called to do. And so without the Ark of the Covenant and without the priesthood and everything else that should have been happening, we find at this point in time all the ordinances that God had put in place are able to be put back into practice once again. So after he settled in his palace, he felt that it would be appropriate to build a suitable house to serve as a sanctuary for Yahweh, Israel's God. He said this to the prophet Nathan, who was at first enthusiastic about the idea, but he later brought a message to David and informed him that he should not build the house. He was told that a son of his, who would succeed him on the throne, would do so. And that was going to be Solomon. Okay, so we come to him soon. So King David had been enjoying a time of rest from his enemies in his new palace, and in company of the prophet of the Lord called Nathan, he said in 2 Samuel chapter 7 verse 2, "Here I am living in a palace of cedar, while the ark of God remains in a tent." So Nathan encouraged King David to do what he thought and assured him that the Lord was with him. So where does the cedar come from? This recurs in the Bible. Does anyone recall where the cedar comes from?
Africa?
No.
Lebanon?
In the region, but...
Ethiopia?
Sorry?
Ethiopia?
Ethiopia? No.
Lebanon.
Lebanon. Correct. Has anyone seen the flag of Lebanon today? Do you recall what it looks like? It has a red band across the top. It has a red band across the bottom. It has a white band in the middle, and placed firmly in the middle of the flag is what's called a Lebanon cedar, a big cedar tree. And so I'm going to go back, looking through the screen. Okay, so here's a bit of information around this. So this is Tyre. So Tyre was the king Hiram, and he was the fellow who was supplying the cedar to King David. What people perhaps don't realise, and I certainly didn't when I first started studying, was that Tyre was actually an island. It actually wasn't part of the mainland. And so we keep hearing about how King Tyre supplies cedar. Where the cedar was, though, is on the actual mainland. There's not a big distance between the two here. And so today, this mainland is exactly that, what we mentioned, it's Lebanon here. So what happened was, and this happens in the future, and we'll come to it, is that when Alexander the Great came along from Macedon, known as the Greek Empire, he built a causeway in 332 BC because they couldn't actually get onto this island of Tyre. It had fortress walls built up full of water, and they couldn't conquer it. No one had ever been able to conquer it. It was impregnable. And so what he decided to do was, instead of trying to muck around in boats, he'd just build a causeway all the way out there, and then he'd be able to go out by land. And so that's what he did. With the time over the years, because this actually has a barrier between the two, it silted up. And today, actually, this is all completely filled in. So this is now the coastline that's there today. But it was originally completely separated. And here's a very ancient map that was drawn. And you can actually see here all the walls, separating the various segments of the island, with the palace in the middle. And so there was this little promontory that was out here. And so this is what gave the idea to Alexander to build it out. When he came along, he built this defensive wall around this whole area, and then he got to work mining basically to get the materials in order to build this causeway out there. So it's quite a fascinating story. As I said, the legacy of this, here's the Lebanese flag, and there's the cedar tree that's in the middle. And the scripture that goes with that is, "Now King Hiram, king of Tyre, sent messengers to David along with cedar logs and carpenters and stonemasons, and they built a palace for David." So he's just said that, why am I living in a palace made from cedar when the Ark of the Covenant is in a tent? And so today we still see an understanding of these trees, which go right back to the time of King David, that there was actually cedar trees there, and it's something that they're very proud of as a nation to make it part of their national flag. And so this was quite an exercise. And so, of course, how did he get the cedar down to the location? How did everything go to Jerusalem? Does anyone remember what the Bible says? How did they get cedar down to Jerusalem?
Waterways?
Oops, come out of the way. So here's Tyre. Here's Lebanon today.
Yeah.
And here's the boundary of Israel at the time. And this is the kingdom of Israel. You can see that it doesn't have Philistia yet. So when this map is produced, it's missing what's called the Golan Heights in Israel today. It's missing this region down here. And of course this goes all the way down to the Red Sea. But that is as a result of the wars that they had in this century. So this was never part of it. But up here, their territories went up to here. So they were neighbours with them. And so this was actually part of Phoenicia. And Tyre was an independent kingdom, if you will, on an island. And so being on an island, that means they had to come over here to harvest the trees, which means they either had an agreement for trade and paid taxes for it, or there was no enemy known there that would actually stop them. And so this is a long way by land. So everything, and the Bible actually tells us, was actually floated by water down to here at Jaffa, which is Tel Aviv today. And from Tel Aviv, they would haul it up to Jerusalem across the land. And so that was the pathway that they brought the cedar down to Jaffa by water, across land, up until Jerusalem. And so this is part of David's, I guess one of his first trade agreements, if you like, when he became king, that this supply would actually come from the king of Tyre. So King David was contemplating how he should construct this house for the Lord when Nathan came to see him, as we mentioned. Nathan told him that he had received a revelation in which the Lord had made it clear that King David was not the one to build a house for him. And so you can imagine that King David was quite disappointed. So we look at the scripture from 2 Samuel chapter 7, verses 11 to 6. So 2 Samuel 7, verses 11 to 6. It reads, "The Lord declares to you that the Lord himself will establish a house for you. When your days are over and you rest with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, who will come from your own body, and I will establish his kingdom. He is the one who will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of the kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he will be my son. When he does wrong, I will punish him with the rod of men, with floggings inflicted by men. But my love will never be taken away from him, as I took it away from Saul, whom I removed before you. Your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever." So this is a really big word that's being given here, because it's saying numerous things. First of all, David's faith is being challenged here, because he's another person, we've been talking about this on Sundays for a while, where he's called to do something which he'll never see the fruit of. And so he has to be obedient to God and allow this honour, as he would probably see it, to pass through to his son. But within this same word, it gets told that this kingdom that's being established now will be a kingdom forever. And so we see the prophetic connection to Jesus coming, in that Jerusalem will be God's city for all time. And obviously that's a part of politics that's been contested to this day. The other thing which is interesting here, though, is he actually says, "I will be his father and he will be my son. When he does wrong, I will punish him with the rod of men, with floggings inflicted by men." Who are we talking about?
Jesus.
Hmm?
Oh, Jesus.
Right.
Oh.
Interesting. Solomon goes really pear-shaped. He starts off incredible. He's known as this gifted man with great wisdom, and then he ends up building places of altars for child sacrifice and everything for all the wives that he has. And unfortunately, the kingdom is going to split as a result of it. So it's pretty dire. But this is a prophetic word which is connected to the throne of the kingdom forever. I will be his father. So he says, I will be his father and he will be my son. Who are we talking about? Jesus. When he does wrong, I will punish him with the rod of men, with floggings inflicted by men. Who whips him? The Romans. But my love will never be taken away from him, as I took it away from Saul, whom I removed before you. Your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever. We're talking about the throne of Jesus. He will come to reign and rule. So this is one of the very strong prophetic words in the Bible, which is often never even spoken about, and was given by the prophet Nathan to King David. So of course we're talking about 1003 BC. And so here's a word that was given as a prophetic word 1,000 years before Christ. And of course it was all fulfilled. In Genesis 3:15, after Adam and Eve ate of the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, the first prophecy of the Messiah, Jesus Christ, is revealed. And it says, and I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head and you will strike his heel. God announced that a Messiah would come in the flesh, the seed or offspring of a woman, who would crush the head of the serpent, Satan, whose deception first caused separation between God and man. With the call of Abraham, the width of the promise of the coming of the Messiah was narrowed to his seed or offspring. So in the beginning it says there will be a seed. There's no parameter from where and whom it will come through. Right? We get to Abraham and we get told that it's going to come through his seed or offspring. And it says in Genesis 12 verses 2 to 3, I will make you into a great nation and I will bless you. I will make your name great and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you I will curse. And it says, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. Then before Jacob, whom the Lord renamed Israel, passed away and was gathered to his people, he blessed and prophesied that through his fourth son Judah, that the Messiah would come from amongst his descendants. And in Genesis 49:10 says, the scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until he comes to whom it belongs, and the obedience of the nations is his. So we see this constant narrowing of the prophetic word, pointing in the direction of whom this person is going to be. And now the prophet Nathan revealed to David that from his house would come the Messiah, who would not just be the king of Israel, but establish his kingdom here on earth. So following the genealogy of Jesus as we are, this journey to faith reveals how God's plan to redeem mankind back to himself comes through progressive revelations, in which the prophetic word of God becomes more specific and more personal. When David heard this word, the Bible tells us that he went into the tent in 2 Samuel chapter 7 verse 18, and it says he sat before the Lord. Dwelling in the Lord's presence to pray, he became emotional about God's goodness and felt unworthy of such a promise. David understood, however, that God blessed him and his house and his people Israel. So as the king of Israel, David administered justice and righteousness for all his people, but he needed help to run God's nation. So he appointed Joab, son of Zeruiah, as a commander over the army, Jehoshaphat, son of Ahilud, as the royal chronicler, or recorder or historian of the king's court, again providing evidence that the events written in the Holy Bible were penned contemporary to the time. Remember how we talk about how Moses is spoken of as writing God's word down? Well, here we find during the time of King David that he had a royal chronicler. Well, who's one of the most prolific writers in the Bible?
Paul.
Solomon and David before him. Right? We've got loads of scripture, whole books, the Psalms pretty much, devoted to David. And so he had someone obviously penning down events, what he spoke, what he prayed about, etc. So Zadok, son of Ahitub, and Ahimelech, son of Abiathar, were priests, and his secretary was called Sariah. Benaiah, son of Jehoiada, pronounce that correctly, commanded David's bodyguards and couriers called the Kerethites and Pelethites, and there's a scholarly consensus that indicates these men were actually Philistines who had been with David when King Saul persecuted him. And David's own sons were his royal advisors or chief ministers. So what we see an organised method of government coming into place with an interaction with the priesthood. And so we're in the business of setting up a kingdom right here. So despite all that he had suffered at the hands of King Saul, King David never stopped loving his son Jonathan. Mourning the day the Philistines had slaughtered him, when King David was holding court in his palace one day, he asked those in attendance, and this was in 2 Samuel chapter 9 verse 1, "Is there anyone still left of the house of Saul to whom I can show kindness for Jonathan's sake?" So this really reveals David's heart. After everything that's happened, he's still there, and he wants to take care of anyone who comes from Jonathan's seed or family. So one of them knew a servant of King Saul's household called Ziba. So they summoned him to appear, and when King David questioned him, he answered in 2 Samuel chapter 9 verse 3, "There is still a son of Jonathan, he is crippled in both feet." Jonathan's son Mephibosheth lived in a place called Lo-debar on the eastern side of the Jordan River. So I'll just go back to that other map. And so this is this place right here called Lo-debar. So you can guess what the word Lo means. It's at the bottom of the escarpment here. And so this is where Jonathan's son lived, and of course David's over here in Jerusalem. On the eastern side of the Jordan River, saying slightly north of Beit Shean. So King David brought him to Jerusalem and reassured him not to be afraid. He expressed his kindness through his love for his father and explained to him in 2 Samuel chapter 9 verse 7, "I will restore to you all the land that belonged to your grandfather Saul, and you will always eat at my table." Why would he restore to him all the land of King Saul, do you think? What's behind that?
Kinship. Kinship?
Kinship? Kin or king?
Kin.
Kinship. Do you want to explain that further? What do you think?
Well, land was owned and then sold to people within the same family.
Right.
But if it was rightfully in his family, then he rightfully owned it.
Right. Very good. So basically, when God gave land for inheritance right in the beginning, that land became the property of their descendants. No matter what happened, remember who gave the land? God. And so David, who always honours God, says that even despite him having this father that tried to kill him and chase him and all the rest of it, that he's still entitled to what God gave to him. And so he restores the land, which tells you that it had been taken away from him. And so once David goes back into power, he puts it all back into place again. So
Mephibosheth.
Thank you. Mephibosheth. It's a good name, isn't it? Was truly humble, but crippled and unable to farm the land himself. King David understood and commanded Ziba, the former servant of King Saul, and his family to do this for him. So Mephibosheth remained in Jerusalem, and fathering a young son called Micah, the blessing of the inheritance God gave to King Saul's family was retained by his descendants. As time passed, Nahash, the king of the Ammonites, died, so they're the people who were formerly ruling on that side, and his son Hanun succeeded him. When David received news of this, he thought in 2 Samuel chapter 10, verse 2, "I will show kindness to Hanun, son of Nahash, just as his father showed kindness to me." So David's a very honouring. All this thing tells you about David's character. He honours those who did the right thing and helped in the past. The kindness that was shown to David is not described in the Holy Bible, but it is thought to be some sort of sympathetic aid or provision given when he was being persecuted by King Saul. This is most likely due to the war waged by King Saul against Nahash the Ammonite at Jabesh Gilead, which was spoken about in 1 Samuel chapter 11, verses 1 to 11. So So that clash that actually happened, there was obviously two sides there, and so David wanted to correct what would happen that was wrong. So David sent a delegation to Rabbah. So this is their capital city of Rabbath Ammon in the Bible. So this is over here. So that's the capital of the kingdom of Ammon. To express his sympathy to Hanun. But when they arrived, they were treated like spies, the Bible tells us, publicly humiliated and sent back. David heard how his messengers forcibly had half of their beards shaved off, and their garments were cut off in the middle of their buttocks. So their backside was exposed. So obviously aimed at humiliating them. So not wanting them to return home humiliated, he sent messages to tell them to stay at Jericho until their beards grew back. Hopefully he gave them some pants as well. Yeah. So the Ammonites realised they had gone too far, and fearing King David's wrath, they hired an army of Aramean foot soldiers from Beth Rehob and Zobar Tob, and 1,000 men who came with the king of Makkah to protect them. So they're located, three of those places are located on the map. And so there's Makkah up the top, Beth Rehob, and over here we have Tob, as it's called. So these are these locations that are mentioned in the Bible. The battle lines were drawn outside the Ammonite city of Rabbah, and when the Arameans and the Ammonites were confronted by the Israelites, the Arameans fled away while the Ammonites fled inside the city walls. The Israelites did not pursue them, instead they went back to Israel. So they weren't there to battle with them, they were just there to set things right. He wasn't interested in going to war. So the Arameans had not given up though. They regrouped, and King Hadadezer of Zobar sought to overcome the Israelites, so he solicited many more Aramean soldiers by reaching far to the east across the other side of the Euphrates River to increase his numbers. So we keep mentioning this word Aramean. Up here, and we go off the top of the map, is what's Syria today. And Syria was actually known as Aram. So it was actually Aram, the capital of Aram was actually Damascus. And Damascus, of course, is the capital of Syria to this day. There was a time when the country was actually known as Aram Damascus as well. So we're talking about Arameans from this region. So they're between Israel going up to the northwest, and so they headed over, as it says here, across the Euphrates River, which is in Iraq today, seeking extra soldiers to come and fight. So they assembled at a place called Halam under Shobak, the commander of King Hadadezer's army, and thought to be north of Damascus towards Hamath. So these locations, not all of them are exactly known, but it's thought that it's up here somewhere. So obviously heading up in that direction. So they're assembled at the top before they're obviously going to come down to do battle. So David learnt of this and gathered all the fighting men of Israel. And crossing the Jordan River, he went up to Halam and defeated the combined forces of the Arameans. Many of those he fought against were vassal kingdoms of King Hadadezer, who after being defeated he made the subjects of Israel. David restored control along the Euphrates River, put garrisons throughout the land and made them pay tribute, or taxes as we know them today. And this put an end to the Arameans' desire to fight. They were afraid and did not help the Ammonites again. When David destroyed the forces of Zobar, an officer called Rezon, son of Eliada, fled from King Hadadezer and gathered men around him. Displaced and defeated by the Israelites, he led his men to Damascus, where they settled, and despite David's garrisons, they rebelled and were hostile to Israel. Rezon not only grew into a powerful and independent chief who continued to be a thorn in their side, but he will eventually come to rule Aram. And you can read about that in 1 Kings chapter 11, verses 23 to 25. And he was the one who would found the dynasty of Syrian kings, who we recognise today as the kingdom of Aram Damascus, otherwise known as Syria. And so this incident back at the time of King David actually led to the formation of the nation today, which we still know as Syria. So it went all this way back, some 3,000 years ago. So there's a lot of secondary things going on around the side while David's obviously settling into his kingdom. So David also defeated and subdued the Philistines at this time. He defeated the Moabites and made them pay tribute, and became famous when he killed 18,000 Edomites in the Valley of Salt at the bottom of the Salt Sea, which of course is the Dead Sea we know today. And David also put garrisons throughout Edom and made them subject to Israel. And so what we're finding here is that, I'll just come back to this map, all of these nations, the Edomites, the Moabites, the Ammonites, these were all nations that when the Israelites went into the land of Canaan, God told them not to fight. Right? Edom is a descendant of, who was the forefather of the Edomites? Who was the brother of Jacob? Esau. Okay? So the Edomites were the descendants of Esau. The Moabites and the Ammonites were the descendants of Lot. Okay? So when the Israelites came, God still considered them his people, and so he said, don't fight against them. But as history reveals, with time, they become aggressors that constantly attack them. And so now David basically goes all the way down this far side, and he sorts them all out, and he puts garrisons all the way down here to prevent them from coming against them any further. Rather have a battle out here than have a battle in here, where his people are getting killed. Take the battle out to the border, firm up the borders, put garrisons there, and then so this is the way that he started to protect his now new kingdom of Israel. So this was happening all early in the piece. So when David was fighting Edom, his commander Joab stayed for 6 months to bury the dead. So that tells you how many people were actually dying. 6 months to bury the dead. During the time, he sought to destroy all of the Edomite men, but some of the king's officials managed to flee to Egypt with Hadad, a young prince from the royal line of Edom. The Pharaoh of Egypt granted them asylum and provided the house with land and some food. And you can read about that in 1 Kings, again chapter 11, verses 14 to 18. So it may seem odd, but wars were usually fought in a season. The season when kings went to war was in spring, after the winter ice thawed and rivers ran. It was the following spring, after the Israelites had defeated the Arameans, that David sent his commander Joab out with his men and the whole Israelite army to destroy the Ammonites and besiege their city, the capital city called Rabbah. But David did not go. He remained behind in Jerusalem and made an evil decision that displeased the Lord. So we're going to just touch on what happened there. So this is, you'll recall the story, and we will go into it. But basically, the story talks about the watchtower, which we're about to go into, so I just thought I'd pop this up. This is in Amman today, so the capital of Jordan, which was the capital back then. And you can see this circular structure. There's a smaller picture here, but the quality's not very good, so I've kept it small. But basically, they would have this huge tower with the soldiers up on top as a watchtower. And then you can see the remains of the ruins here, of the balance of the building structures over there. So this is still there to this very day, this watchtower. So the Bible tells us that King David had been lying in bed one evening when he got up and went for a walk on the roof of his palace. It was spring and the night air had begun to warm, and as he was walking he couldn't help but notice that there was a beautiful woman laying in a bath. Unable to control his curiosity, he sent a messenger to discover that she was the wife of Uriah the Hittite. Called Bathsheba, King David sent for her, and unable to control his lust, he slept with her and committed adultery. She went back home, but she had become pregnant. So what did good King David do? So up to now we hear about how good King David is. So King David sends for her husband Uriah, who was fighting with the army at the siege of Rabbah. He knew that if he could provide the opportunity for Uriah to lie with his wife in a timely manner, that he could conceal his sin and his identity as the father of Bathsheba's child. David's sort of fallen down the ladder a little bit here, hasn't he? A lot. So King David was notified when Uriah arrived at the palace. After greeting him, he first asked him and the soldiers before for news of how the war was going. Recognising Uriah must be tired after his journey, King David told him to go home, but he didn't, because he was honourable. Uriah slept at the palace entrance with his servants. King David questioned him, but he responded that while his companions remained in the field of battle, and it says in 2 Samuel chapter 11 verse 11, "How can I go to my house to eat and drink and lie with my wife? As surely as you live, I will not do such a thing." So David's got a problem. So King David kept Uriah there for 2 more days, but he still didn't go home to his wife. So King David's plan had been thwarted. So he sent him back to Joab with a message. And in 2 Samuel 11 verse 15 he said, "Put Uriah on the front line where the fighting is fiercest, then withdraw from him so he will be struck down and die." Uriah is literally murdered. King David committed one sin to cover another. So King David received news of Uriah's death, and Uriah's wife was also informed, and after the time for mourning was over, King David had her brought to the palace, and Bathsheba became his wife, and she bore him a son. But there's a price that's going to be paid. In 2 Samuel chapter 11 verse 27 it says, "But the thing David had done displeased the Lord. Committing adultery and having Uriah murdered made God angry with David. So the Lord sent Nathan the prophet to rebuke him, reveal how he would be punished, and extraordinarily be forgiven. The prophet Nathan came to see King David and told him a parable, which we know to be a story or a tale, about a rich man who had many cattle and sheep, who took the only ewe lamb of a poor man to feed a traveller. King David responded angrily and deemed that this man deserved to die and should pay for the lamb 4 times over. Nathan, of course, said in verse 7 of 2 Samuel chapter 12, "You are that man." So he went on to reveal the word of the Lord. So in verse 9 it says, "Why did you despise the word of the Lord by doing what is evil in your eyes? You struck down Uriah the Hittite with a sword and took his wife to be your own." So when we're talking about the word of the Lord here, we're also talking about the commandments that God gave that are written down throughout the Bible. And so he knows that it's wrong, and yet he chose to do it anyway. And as we learn, evil often repays evil. When someone does something wrong, they do something worse to try and cover it up. So Nathan said in verse 13, "The Lord has taken away your sin. You are not going to die, but you will pay a severe price, for God will punish you in 3 different ways." You have to understand at this point that King Solomon is not born. If King David is put to death, then the fulfilment of the covenant of God, the genealogy of Jesus, the descendants that pass from descendant to descendant, is going to be a problem. And so God doesn't kill David, but he punishes him in 3 different ways. So the first one, reading from 2 Samuel chapter 12 verse 10, it says that descendants from every generation will die a violent death, when it says the sword will never depart from your house. Okay, so when we talk about the sword, we talk about fighting, we talk about killing. And so Nathan says that the sword will never depart from his house. When we're talking about the house, we're talking about the house of?
God.
Sorry? God?
David.
David? David? Well, David's the ruler of the house of Israel. Okay? He's the ruling family, but he rules what's known as the house of Israel. And so we're finding here, there's a consequence of what David's done right in his early piece, and we know this from the history that follows, that there's going to be non-stop fighting, non-stop bloodshed. It never stops. And so this goes all the way through, of course, until they get put out into exile again, because it never gets corrected. But here we're finding out that this is going to be so even before it's happened. So, of course, we find in this that Jesus, as one of David's descendants, paid the same price. See, Jesus was killed. And we're talking about the flesh here. So we find that the prophecy here also applies to Jesus in the future. So Nathan's prophecy here is also connected to Jesus. The next point, the second thing, is that you will see, so this is coming from 2 Samuel chapter 12 again, but verses 11 to 12. You will see before your very eyes your own wives taken and given to a man from your own family who will sleep with them in broad daylight, not in secret like you did with Bathsheba. So David's going to be repaid with a sin which is akin to what he has just done to Uriah. And the third one, from 2 chapter 12 verse 14, says the son born to you will die. So this child that Bathsheba is carrying will actually not survive. And so there's no upside coming out of this whole event. David has sinned, he did another sin to cover a sin, and now he's going to be punished. So we see the cycle that I talk about in the Bible where we have sin, then punishment, right? Then they get rescued, and then they get restored again. And so David is on this same cycle just like every other person. So King David repented his sin to God. He fasted and prayed, but his son did not get well. So in other words, even though he'd received this word, he didn't want to lose his son. But his son did not get well. He died on the 7th day after he was born. King David had been on the floor all week. He rose, prepared himself, and went out to the house of the Lord and worshipped. When he returned home to eat, his servants asked him why he cried when the baby was alive, but ended his mourning when it died. King David replied in 2 Samuel 12 verses 22 to 23, "While the child was still alive, I fasted and wept. I thought, who knows, the Lord may be gracious to me and let the child live. But now that he is dead, why should I fast? Can I bring him back again? I will go to him, but he will not return to me." And so it's a very sad finish to this situation. So in this way, one of God's punishments for David's sin was immediately fulfilled. David comforted his wife Bathsheba and slept with her, and from this union she later gave birth to a son who they would name Solomon. And so God will fulfill what he promised, but David was punished for what he did wrong. So David submitted to the will of God in the death of his son, and God made up this loss in the birth of another. Sounds reminiscent of other parts of the Bible, isn't it? After the death of a child, people submit themselves to God, even the Egyptian Pharaoh. God's grace favoured Solomon, and he sent word through the prophet Nathan that he was to be called Jedediah, which means beloved of the Lord. David also expresses his understanding and confidence that there is life beyond the grave, immortality of the soul, recognising that he would one day go to heaven to be with his innocent son, whom he loved here on earth. David would later have other sons by Bathsheba called Shammua, Shobab, and Nathan. And Nathan becomes the other son that leads the other genealogy in the book of Luke. So when the genealogy comes after David and it splits to the two descendant lines, one starts with Nathan and one starts with Solomon. So Nathan, of course, is this boy that we've just spoken about here, and Nathan heads up the genealogy of Jesus in the book of Luke, and Solomon, of course, in the book of Matthew. So there's a connection between those two there as well. Whilst this transpired, so we're just about to wrap up, David's commander Joab and many Israelite soldiers who had been fighting against the Ammonites at Rabbah had captured the water supply in the royal citadel. Joab asked David to come with more troops to besiege and capture the city. This David did, and when he was there, he took the heavy gold crown of their king, the idol of their false god Molech, and placed it on his own head. The crown was made from a talent of gold, which is 34 kilograms. So a bag of cement is 20 kilograms. So this is almost twice the weight of a bag of cement, this crown which he put on his head. So it's incredibly heavy. So you can imagine the size that it must, and the thickness that it must have been. And adorned with precious stones. The city and then all of the other Ammonite cities were overcome and plundered. Their people were taken and put to work as slaves, required to labour with saws, picks and axes. They were also made to produce bricks, which is to this very day what slaves do around the world. In Pakistan today, poor people are indentured as slaves to pay off debts, and what do they make them do? Make bricks. They make so little money that by the time they feed them, their debt increases and they remain in slavery. So this has been happening since the dawn of time. What was the Egyptian Pharaoh doing to the Israelites? Making bricks. So bricks seems to be the domain of slave labour. With the passing of time, King David had married 8 different women, amongst them Maachah, the daughter of the king of Geshur from Syria, bore him a son called Absalom, a daughter called Tamar. Another wife, Mahanaim the Jezreelite, also bore him a son, Amnon. So we'll finish on that note. So tonight we've gone through this journey with David as he establishes his kingdom. We see the son of Saul, King Ish-Bosheth. He's actually murdered, and so he's deposed from that sense of the word. So David takes over the full united kingdom of Israel. We find the early part of his journey is fighting against all these enemies, and as a consequence there's a number of battles, and in one of these battles we find of course that David is tempted and he sleeps with Bathsheba. We come through and find out about some of the next generation, King Solomon being one of the main people. From there we find out about Nathan here of course, who heads up the genealogy from Luke, and we also learn that the Ark of the Covenant has been returned, and that David will not be the one who builds the temple, but in fact the son Solomon, whom the Bible tells us was named Jedediah, because he was loved by God so much. And so God had a special purpose for Solomon, which we will continue to learn about in the future lessons. So we're going to draw to a close. So I'm just going to mention, thank you for joining us. We're broadcasting from Facebook on the Jesus Movement, on that address. All of these videos are put onto YouTube for you to watch again. So you type in my name, Paul Brunton, and the Jesus Movement, and it'll bring you to the YouTube channel which you can subscribe to. And the videos can also be watched on the jesusmovement.com.au on our website. So thank you for joining me. We look forward to having you join us again next week. God bless you and be safe.